Beyond Barbarossa, Episode 98. The Great Race Begins. Welcome to Beyond Barbarossa, the first English-language podcast in the world to focus on the Eastern Front of World War II. I'm Scott Burry, podcasting from the Redbeard Studio on unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people, also called Ottawa, capital of free, independent, sovereign Canada. Today I'm joined by my indispensable recording assistant, Ragnar the Magnificent Ragdoll Cat. Before we begin the episode itself, I have a couple of announcements. First, Beyond Barbarossa has been rated as number 6 in all English language podcasts about the Second World War by FeedSpot Today. And it's number 1 in World War II podcasts emanating from Canada. Woohoo! My second announcement is, this being episode 98, number 100 is coming up soon, and I plan for it to be live on 8th of May, the anniversary of the end of the war in Europe. I know that won't be a spoiler for you listeners. After all, studies show that listeners to Beyond Barbarossa are smarter and better looking than average. But on the other hand, they're also slightly more likely to spoil a romantic interlude by talking about their favorite World War II podcast. These studies are completely made up. But seriously, I am happy to announce that another excellent podcaster, David Sumner from the Europe at War podcast, will be joining me on episode 100 to talk about the final days of the war in Europe and provide some really unmatchable insight into that part of the war. Last episode on the Eastern Front described the Germans' Unternehmen Frühlingserwachen, or Operation Spring Awakening, one of Nazi Germany's last offensives in the war. It failed spectacularly in its objective to keep the Red Army out of the Plattensee area, or Lake Balaton region in western Hungary, which was about Germany's last source of petroleum. The Soviet 3rd Ukrainian Front and the 5th Air Army of the 2nd Ukrainian Front, remember a Red Army front is a group of armies. Anyway, these two fronts prevented the German advance and destroyed German Army Group F. It killed nearly 50,000 soldiers and captured 125,000 more. The surviving Wehrmacht units hightailed it out of Hungary completely, hoping to set up defenses at the Rob River, the Hungarian-Austrian border, thereby to defend Vienna. They saw Vienna as extra special. It was a fortress city, but it was more than a fortress city like Wrocław or Holm or Sevastopol or Smolensk or one of the many other so-called Festungen. Vienna was more than this. It was, at this point, a core of the German identity. I'm going to quote a few times from Antony Beevor's definitive and comprehensive book, The Second World War, to wit, Hitler's special envoy, Edmund Wiesenmayer, insisted on the Führer's instruction that Budapest should be defended to the last brick. It did not matter, he said, if Budapest was, quote, destroyed 10 times, so long as Vienna could thereby be defended. After taking Budapest and driving the Germans out of Hungary, the Red Army's next target was, of course, Vienna. Wien in German. They were moving remarkably fast, so they managed to catch up to the Rob River before the Germans could properly dig in. It's just another example of the speed that the Red Army had been moving at. Just think of the advance the Soviets had made over the year from April 1944 to April 1945. 1,000 miles or 1,600 kilometers. Over that past 12 months, they had recaptured Ukraine, Belarus, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all of Poland, including the part that Germany had occupied since 1939. The USSR also now controlled most of East Prussia and Pomerania. Romania and Bulgaria were also pretty much under the control of the Soviets. They had gone over to the Soviet side when they saw that the Red Army was coming and the Germans were unable to stop it. The Soviets were also pretty much in control of Yugoslavia, although the Yugoslavian communists under Josip Broz or Tito would have a lot to say about that in the future. As you can see in map 1, the Red Army was, by March 1945, deep into Germany, on the banks of the Oder and Niesse rivers. Today, that's the border between Germany and Poland, but before the war, that area, Silesia, along the Oder River, as described in the previous 2 episodes, that was all part of Eastern Germany. So here we are, after the Silesian offensives, the Red Army poised for a final, if costly, strike toward the ultimate prize, Berlin, the Nazi capital, as you can see in map 2. But before they made that advance, the Stavka, the Soviet High Military Command, knew it had to secure its flanks, which meant advancing west along the Baltic coast in the north and to the south into Austria. To quote from Evan Maudslay's Thunder in the East, the Nazi-Soviet War 1941 to 1945, on 17 February 1945, the Stavka issued a series of directives to the various army groups. The 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian army groups, commanded by Marshals Rodion, Malinovsky, and Fyodor Tolbukhin, respectively, were to complete the capture of Western Hungary and drive northwest into the Czech lands and west up the Danube to Vienna. Budapest had fallen 4 days earlier, and this was a time of considerable optimism in the Stavka, at least as far as the Southern Theater was concerned. The operation was scheduled to start on 15 March and to be completed within 20 days. End quote. After the disastrous Operation Spring Awakening, the German 6th Panzer Army, or what was left of it, retreated as fast as they could to Austria, thinking that they could hold a position on the western side of the Rob River. But Fyodor Tolbukhin's 3rd Ukrainian Front was right behind them. Any fantasies about so-called German soil holding out longer than non-German were just that, fantasies. However, once they were in what they perceived as German territory, the Wehrmacht defenders did fight harder. I think that was more due to hatred and fear of the Russians, and a hope to surrender to the Americans, British, or even the French. I think that explains a lot more about the resistance to the Red Army. As the 3rd Ukrainian Front is advancing on Vienna, the 2nd Ukrainian Front, commanded by Rodion Malinovsky, moved to protect Tolbukhin's flank. On 25th March, the 7th Guards Army, with the help of the Soviet Danubian Fleet, crossed the Rhine River, site of the fighting in last episode, and they broke through the German defenses. By the 2nd of April, they captured the Bratislava airport, and by the 4th had driven the Germans out completely, as well as the German puppet government of Slovakia, which bugged out, fled further west. After that, the 2nd Ukrainian Front, which included the 7th Guards Army and the 53rd Army, as well as the Romanian 4th Army, turned north for Brno, capital of Moravia, now part of the Czech Republic. The most important part, though, the point, was that they had protected the flank of the 3rd Ukrainian Front as it crossed the Austrian border heading for Vienna. And let's get into Vienna after this short break. Hi, Scott here. I hope you're enjoying this episode and that you get a lot out of the whole podcast. If you do like it and you want to help me keep it going, please give it a rating or a review on Apple, Google, Amazon, Podbean, or whatever podcasting platform you listen to it on. That helps let other people know about it. Patreon's another way you can support the podcast, my research, and podcasting expenses. All you have to do is go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa and sign up at whatever level of support you choose. Patreon supporters get early, ad-free access to new episodes, as well as exclusive bonus episodes on topics like the Winter War between the USSR and Finland and the pre-Barbarossa invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in 1939. Check it out, won't you? Just go to patreon.com/beyondbarbarossa. Thanks.
Did you know that the cappuccino was invented by a Ukrainian? Or that many first names, like Philip and Agatha, were brought to Western Europe by Ukrainian princesses? Or that a Ukrainian was the first female given the rank of officer in a modern army? Well, if you didn't, and even if you did, you can learn more on my podcast, Wandering the Edge, a podcast about Ukrainian history with a spot of travel, and all in English. And if you like Beyond Barbarossa as much as I do, because, well, it makes my life a whole lot easier since I don't have to do any episodes deep diving into the Eastern Front of the Second World War, please take a listen to Wandering the Edge for a deep dive into Ukrainian history, culture, and traditions. Find out more on wanderingtheedge.net. And now let's get back to Scott exploring and explaining the Eastern Front of the Second World War.
Welcome back. This is part 2 of episode 98 of Beyond Barbarossa, the first English language podcast focusing on the full story of the Eastern Front of World War II. We're talking about the great race between the Western Allies and the Soviets, and among the Soviets themselves, for the capital of Berlin. Right now, we're going to focus on the Red Army's advance to Vienna, capital of Austria, which, after 1938, was part of the Central German Reich. On 2nd April 1945, as the 2nd Ukrainian Front was getting into Bratislava, which is actually only about 80 kilometers east of Vienna itself. So as the 2nd Ukrainian Front is clearing the Germans out of there, the 3rd Ukrainian Front was approaching the outskirts of the Austrian capital. This force comprised 1,171,000 men in 77 divisions, with 1,600 tanks and assault guns and over 5,000 other guns. Opposing them were 25 German divisions, 270,000 men, 1/3 of the number in the Red Army coming for them. They were equipped with 772 tanks and assault guns, so less than half of what the Red Army was bringing. Tolbukhin's 3rd Ukrainian Front came up from the south, following the Lake Balaton offensive I described last episode. 2 days after Malinovsky's forces took Bratislava, the 3rd Ukrainian Front was only 60 kilometers, or 40 miles south of Vienna. The only German unit left with any strength to oppose them was the 2nd SS Panzer Corps of the 6th SS Panzer Army. They also had some other scattered, shattered units left over from other engagements. They managed to hold the Red Army back for about 3 more days. By 7th April, the Soviets were in the southern suburbs, and the next day, the 6th Guards Tank Army and the 9th Guards Army had entered the western side of the city, taking the main railway station. By evening, the Soviets were also squeezing from the northern suburbs, cutting the capital off from the rest of Austria. Meanwhile, other armies of the 3rd Ukrainian Front split off, heading more westerly toward the town of Graz, where Gestapo and Waffen-SS massacred resistance fighters, Jewish forced laborers, and PLWs. Another group headed toward Linz, Hitler's hometown and the site of the Mauthausen concentration camp, about 180 kilometers or 120 miles west of Vienna. In episodes 49 and 50, I spoke with author Mike Croissant about his book, Bombing Hitler's Hometown. It was about the last mass bombing raid of the war. So have a listen to that to refresh your memory. That's episodes 49 and 50. Listen after you finish listening to this episode, of course. As they advanced into Vienna, fierce urban fighting continued, but the German situation was hopeless. Still, as they had done in so many other cities over the past year, 2 years, the Germans continued to fight, a hopeless defense. By 10th April, the Germans had destroyed most of the bridges in Vienna. That night, the 2nd SS Panzer Division, the notorious Das Reich, left several artillery pieces behind to hold off the Soviets a little bit longer, and with their last 36 armored vehicles, pulled out of the city for the last time, leaving the 2nd SS Panzer Corps alone. With the remaining forces of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps stubbornly fighting in a shrinking center of the city, on 13 April, the Soviet 80th Guards Rifle Division and the 7th Guards Airborne Division came up the Danube River on boats, landing on either side of the Reichsbrücke Bridge, kind of the central bridge over the Danube in the city, and the only one left intact in Vienna. The defenders finally surrendered at this, but the remnants of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps broke out westward. Vienna had fallen to the Soviets, leaving much of the beautiful city in ruins, and the surviving inhabitants without food, water, or power, and at the mercy of the Red Army, which came in to commit a wave of murders and rapes. As the Red Tide continued westward, chasing the 6th SS Panzer Army past Linz and the 2nd Panzer Army south of Graz. Quoting once again from Evan Maudsley, "The Red Army's operations in Austria were not a historical footnote or a minor mopping up operation. Hitler's heart was here rather than in the north, and he had been generous with what reinforcements he had available. There was fanatical resistance for the homeland. The 3rd Ukrainian Army Group claimed that in the battles from mid-March to mid-April 1945, it destroyed no fewer than 11 Axis armored divisions, including the Waffen-SS Panzer Divisions Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, Totenkopf, Hitlerjugend, and Viking. In terms of troops committed, the Soviet Vienna operation was only about a third the size of the Berlin operation. As a portion of the forces involved, however, losses were heavier, 39,000 troops." End quote. Now it's time to shift our attention northward again to the greatest prize, the object of the races between the Western Allies and two immense Soviet army groups. Of course I mean Berlin. The race was on. Let's get into it after this short break.
As Scott elegantly describes in each episode of Beyond Barbarossa, the war on the Eastern Front was truly gargantuan, both in terms of its geography and its destructiveness. But given that there is so much territory to cover, and that so many millions of men were involved in the fighting, it's perhaps inevitable that some battles from the Eastern Front get overlooked. I'm David Sumner, and I'm the host of Europe at War, a weekly podcast exploring lesser-known battles and stories of the Second World War, with a particular focus on the Eastern Front. From the drama of thousands of trapped German soldiers and terrified civilians attempting to break out of the Halbe pocket, to the unexpected and blistering counterattack launched by German forces on the Red Army during the Battle of Bautzen. Many of the Eastern Front's most dramatic battles, particularly those which happened towards the end of the war, have long been neglected by historians, and their stories have remained untold. Until now. So to hear these incredible tales from the Eastern Front and more, check out Europe at War, available on all podcast platforms. Thank you. Now let's get back to the show.
Welcome to part 3. Thanks for coming with me. By March 1945, the Red Army was poised for a drive toward Berlin. But the Soviets were not the only ones with eyes on the German capital. Some of the Western Allies were also determined to have the honor of capturing it first. By 7 March, the Americans had crossed the Rhine River in the Battle of Remagen when the U.S. First Army charged across the Ludendorff Bridge over the Rhine River after the Germans failed to destroy it. The Americans then established a bridgehead that allowed them to capture Cologne, Germany, by the end of March 1945. Then, on 23rd March, British, American, and Canadian forces crossed the Rhine in Operation Plunder. It started with Operation Varsity, the largest single-day airborne operation in history, when 16,000 paratroopers landed on the eastern side of the Rhine at Wesel, Germany. This allowed Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group to penetrate into northern Germany for the first time. The two forces, the two pincers, the Americans from the south and Montgomery's combined army group from the north, met on 1st April east of the Ruhr River, the industrial heartland of Western Germany, and encircled 317,000 German troops. The U.S. Ninth Army and part of the First Army reduced the encirclement, destroying or capturing it all over 2 weeks. Montgomery's forces, meanwhile, pushed eastward toward the Elbe River. By late March 1945, the Western Allied leaders saw a clear path toward Berlin. Many were determined to get there before the Soviets did. General George Patton, commander of the U.S. Third Army, urged Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower to take Berlin, saying that Montgomery's forces could get there from the Elbe River in 3 days. Once again, to quote from Antony Beevor, Churchill was hoping for a rapid advance. He was concerned that the Soviet-Yugoslav Treaty, which was signed 2 days later, would support Tito's claims to Trieste and Istria at the head of the Adriatic. Churchill turned down Tito's requests for more aid. Since the Yugoslavs had entered the Soviet embrace, they could look instead to Moscow for assistance. He, Churchill that is, also feared that Soviet power in the region might encourage the Italian communists, whose partisans already represented a powerful force in northern Italy. End quote. By the end of March, with German forces trapped in the Ruhr pocket, Montgomery assumed he'd be leading the drive to take Berlin. But on 30th March, his boss, Eisenhower, ordered Montgomery's 21st Army Group to head not for Berlin, but Hamburg and Denmark. Except for the U.S. Ninth Army, which was to continue with the destruction of the Ruhr pocket. Eisenhower, or Ike as he was known, appeared to be torn over the idea of advancing to Berlin. Again, Antony Beevor records this exchange. On 8th April, Eisenhower visited Major General Alexander Bolling, the commander of the 84th Infantry Division, after it had taken the city of Hanover. "Alex, where are you going next?" Eisenhower asked him. "General, we're going to push on ahead. We have a clear go at Berlin, and nothing can stop us." "Keep going," Eisenhower told him, and put a hand on his shoulder. "I wish you all the luck in the world, and don't let anybody stop you." Bolling understood this as confirmation that Berlin was their objective. But soon after this, Ike apparently had a change of heart, or at least direction. General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group, told Ike that taking Berlin could cost as much as 100,000 American casualties, although after the war, Bradley admitted he probably overestimated. Still, Eisenhower was turning away from the idea of the Americans or the Western Allies capturing Berlin. There was also a really important political dimension to this question. At the Yalta Conference in early February, the big three Allied leaders, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, had agreed that Berlin would be in the Soviet zone of occupation following the end of the war. Ike apparently reasoned that the Yalta Agreement would mean that if the Western Allies did beat the Red Army in taking Berlin, which seemed possible because in April, they were encountering very light, almost perfunctory resistance by the Germans. Remember how I said the Germans preferred to surrender to the Western Allies than to the Soviets. So if the Western Allies took Berlin, they would only have to hand it over to the Soviets under the terms of the Yalta Agreement and then withdraw about 200 kilometers. So they would have suffered those 100,000 casualties, not to hold the prize itself. The upshot is that Eich decided not to drive toward Berlin. He ordered Montgomery's forces to halt on the west side of the Elbe River, although the Western Allies did have a number of bridgeheads on the eastern side. This evoked howls of protest from many quarters, including George Patton and even Churchill. Still, Eich ordered Patton and his Third Army to strike into southern Germany, toward Bavaria, and into Czechoslovakia, because of intelligence reports that the Nazis were setting up an Alpen fortress as a last redoubt. To be fair, some of the Nazi leadership had laid such plans, including Hermann Goering, number 2 in the Nazi hierarchy. This decision by Eisenhower caused a lot of controversy, and it's still debated today more than 80 years later, because it handed the prize, Berlin, to the Soviets without any further argument. According to Antony Beevor, from the moment Stalin heard that the Americans were across the Rhine, he knew that the race for Berlin was on. Stalin had 2 vital reasons for wanting to take Berlin before the Allies. The lair of the fascist beast was the key symbol of victory after all the Soviet Union had suffered, and Stalin had no intention of allowing any other flag to fly over the city. Berlin had also been the center for Nazi Germany's atomic research, mainly at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physics in Dahlem. Through his spies, Stalin was well aware of the Manhattan Project in the United States and its progress toward creating an atomic bomb." End quote. Anyone who's seen the movie Oppenheimer or read about the Manhattan Project, and I'm confident that every listener to this podcast has done both, knows about Klaus Fuchs, the German theoretical physicist who was instrumental in developing the first atomic bomb and later the hydrogen bomb. You also know that while working in Los Alamos, the Manhattan Project in New Mexico, he passed information through a network of spies to the Soviet Union. He was only the most notorious atomic spy for the USSR. So yes, the Soviets were very much aware of the West's atomic bomb project and were working frantically on their own by 1945. Again, from Antony Beevor. The Soviet nuclear research program, Operation Borodino, had received full priority, but the Russians were short of uranium, which they hoped to seize in Berlin. By 1945, NKVD spies had located 3 tons of uranium oxide in Berlin from Nazi Germany's own atomic bomb project. This gave the USSR yet another reason to win the race to Berlin. Soviet intelligence, although informed of every detail of the Manhattan Project, had no idea that the bulk of the uranium and most of the scientists they wanted had been evacuated from Berlin to Hagerloch in the Black Forest. On 1st April, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin summoned the commanders of the 1st Belarusian Front and the 1st Ukrainian Front, Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev respectively, to his office. Again from Antony Beevor. "Well then," Stalin said, staring at his 2 marshals, "who is going to take Berlin? Are we or are the Allies?" "It is we who shall take Berlin," Konev replied immediately, "and we will take it before the Allies." Konev was evidently keen to beat Zhukov to the prize, and Stalin, who liked to create a rivalry between his commanders, approved. End quote. So, as you can see, Stalin set up a race. Now that the USSR had won or had taken the reins of the race and the Western Allies were no longer in it for Berlin, he set up another one between his 2 main marshals, Zhukov and Konev, to be the first to reach the Nazi capital and hoist the red banner over the Reichstag. Who would win the race? Which Red Army front would be the one to have the honor of raising that red banner over the hated symbol of the enemy regime? To find out, come back in 2 weeks for episode 99 of Beyond Barbarossa, the top World War II podcast from Canada and in the top 10 in the world. Thanks. Thank you for listening to Beyond Barbarossa, the first English language podcast that focuses on telling the full story of the Eastern Front of the Second World War. And as I said, we're in the top 10 of all English language podcasts about World War II. So thanks to everyone for your support and for being there. As always, you can find maps and photos to illustrate this episode on the website beyondbarbarossa.ca. Do use that address, please, as this podcast is going to move from its current platform soon. It will still be available on all the podcasting apps. It's just that the way I go about publishing it is going to have to change. You can also reach the podcast from my own website, writtenword.ca, and click on the podcast button in the banner. A special thanks to all who have supported the podcast through Patreon. Patreon supporters get early, ad-free episodes, and until all Ukrainian refugees can return home safely, your financial support goes to charities that help them. Please hit that follow or subscribe button. That helps other people who don't know about Beyond Barbarossa to find it. And if you have a couple of minutes, a rating or a review on your preferred podcasting app would make a huge difference. Do you have something to add? A historical fact, an insight, a question, a clarification, a correction? Reach me by email, scott@beyondbarbarossa.ca, or through the Facebook Beyond Barbarossa page. Original music was composed and recorded by Nicholas Burry. I'm Scott Burry. Until next time, keep your paddles in the water. Slava Ukraina, Viva Canada.